Chapter 9. One morning, immediately after we had passed a deserted village, we started hearing something like the roar of big engines, the rolling of metal drums on a tar road, a thunder exploding roll after roll. All these sounds reached our ears simultaneously. We hurriedly deviated from the path, running into the bushes and lying on the ground. We searched one another's faces for an explanation for this strange sound. Even Kanye, who sometimes had answers, couldn't tell us what we were hearing. We all looked at him, and his face contorted with confusion. "We have to find out what it is, or we can't continue on to Yele," Kanye whispered, and then began to crawl toward the sound. We followed him, quietly dragging our bodies on rotten leaves. As we got closer, the sound intensified, and the heavy breeze shook the trees above us. We could clearly see the blue sky, but nothing else. Kanye hesitantly sat on his heels and surveyed the area. "It is just water, lots of it, and sand, lots of it." Kanye was still looking. "What is making the noise then?" ALWG asked. "All I'm looking at is water and sand," Kanye replied, and then waved us to come closer and take a look. We sat on our heels for a while, looking in different directions, trying to locate what was making the sound. Without saying anything to us, Kanye crawled into the bushes and started walking on the sand toward the water. It was the Atlantic Ocean. The sounds we had heard were those of the waves hitting the shore. I had seen parts of the ocean, but had never stood on the shore of one this vast. It spread out beyond the vision of my eyes. The sky was at its bluest and seemed to curve down and join with the ocean in the distance. My eyes widened, a smile forming on my face. Even in the middle of the madness, there remained that true and natural beauty, and it took my mind away from my current situation as I marveled at this sight. We walked closer and sat at the edge of the sand and stared at the ocean, admiring the display of the waves in succession. They came in three folds. The first was small but powerful enough to break a person's leg. The second was high and more powerful than the first, and the third was a spectacle. It rolled and rose higher than the shoreline as it moved forward. We ran away from where we sat. The wave hit the shore so hard that it sent sand particles flying high up in the sky. When we went back to look, the waves had thrown out unwanted float sand from the ocean, including some big crabs that I guess weren't strong enough to cling to the ocean floor, but they were still alive. It was a calm walk along the sand, since we didn't expect trouble in this part of the country. We chased and wrestled each other on the sand, played somersault and running games. We even bundled up ALWG's old shirt and tied a rope around it to make a soccer ball. We then played a game where each one of us scored a goal. He would celebrate with a sukus dance. We shouted, laughed, and sang our secondary school songs. We started walking on the sandy beach early in the morning and saw the sunrise. At midday, we saw a cluster of huts ahead and raced each other toward them. When we arrived there, we suddenly became worried. There was no one in the village. Motors lay in the sand, rice spilling out of them, jerry cans leaked water, and fires were left unattended under cooking huts. Our first guess was that the rebels might have been here, but before we could think of anything else, fishermen sprang from behind the huts with machetes, fishing spear, and nets in their hands. We were so shocked by this sudden uproar that none of us was able to run. Instead, we shouted, "Please, we are harmless and just passing by," in every possible one of the 18 local languages that each of us knew. The fishermen jabbed us with the flat edges of their weapons until we fell on the ground. They sat on top of us, tied our hands, and took us to their chief. The villagers had heard a rumor that some young people, believed to be rebels, were heading their way. Upon hearing this, they had armed themselves and hid, waiting to defend their homes and protect their families. This should not have been a big shock to us, but we didn't expect it to happen here, since we thought that we were now far from harm. They asked us several questions along the lines of, where were we from, where were we going, and why did we choose that direction? ALWG, the tallest among us, sometimes mistaken for the oldest, tried to explain to the chief that we were just passing by. Afterward, the men yanked our torn caps, our shoes off of our feet, untied us, and chased us out of their village, waving their spears and machetes and screaming after us. We didn't realize what sort of punishment the fishermen had given us until we stopped running from their village. The sun was in the middle of the sky. It was over 120 degrees, and we were barefoot. The humidity by the sea was less than inland, but since there were no trees to provide shade, the sun penetrated right into the sand, making it hot and loose. Walking barefoot on the sand was like walking on a hot tar road. The only escape from this pain was to keep walking and hope for something miraculous. We couldn't walk into the water or the wet sand near its edge. It was very deep between where we walked and where the water met the land, and the waves were dangerous. After I had cried for several hours, my feet became numb. I continued walking, but couldn't feel the soles of my feet. We walked on the hot, burning sand until sunset. I have never longed for a day to conclude as I did that day. I thought the arrival of sunset would heal my pain, but as the heat died down, the anesthesia also wore away. Each time I lifted my feet, the veins in them tightened, and I felt the sand particles digging into my bleeding soles. The next several miles were so long that I didn't think I would be able to make it. I perspired, and my body shuddered from the pain. Finally, we came upon a hut that was on the sand. None of us were able to talk. We walked inside and sat down on logs around a fireplace. There were tears in my eyes, but I was unable to cry because I was too thirsty to make a sound. I looked around to see the faces of my traveling companions. They were crying as well, without a sound. Hesitantly, I looked under my feet. Peeled flesh hung down, and congealed blocks of blood and particles of sand clung to each other, to each hanging bit of skin. It looked as if someone had literally used a blade to cut the flesh under my feet from the heel to the toes. Discouraged, I looked into the sky through a tiny hole in the thatched roof, trying not to think about my feet. As we sat in silence, the man whose hut we had occupied came in. He stopped at the door and was about to turn around when he noticed our suffering. His eyes met our frightened faces. Musa had just lifted his foot and was trying to separate the sand from his flesh. The rest of us were holding our knees so that our feet wouldn't touch the ground. The man motioned for Musa to stop what he was doing. He shook his head and left. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a basket full of some type of grass. He quietly made a fire and heated the grass, and then placed them underneath each of our hanging feet. The steam from the grass rose to our soles, and it gradually lessened the pain. The man left without saying anything. Later, he returned with fried fish soup, rice, and a bucket of water. He put the food before us and motioned for us to eat. Again, he disappeared, returning a few minutes later, this time smiling widely. He had a fishing net on his shoulder and held a pair of oars and a big flashlight. You Pekindum feel better, right? Without waiting to hear whether we were feeling better or not, he went on to tell us where the sleeping mats were and that he was going fishing and would be back in the morning. He didn't even bother to ask our names. I guess he didn't think it was necessary or important at that moment. Before he left, he gave us an ointment to rub on our feet and stressed that we do it before going to sleep. We were very quiet that night. No one said a word. The following morning, our nameless host came again with food and a smile on his face that said he was glad that we were doing fine. We couldn't walk well, so we just hobbled around the hut and made fun of each other to avoid boredom. Kane boasted of being an excellent soccer player. Musa threw him a groundnut shell. Kane moved his foot to kick it, then realized that it would hurt and abruptly swung his foot back, dragging it against a stone. He began to blow on his sole in pain. What kind of soccer player are you going to be if you're afraid to kick an empty groundnut shell? Musa laughed. We all gradually began to laugh. Musa had a round face, and he was short and bulky, with the tiny round ears that matched his face. His eyes were big and looked as if they wanted to leave his face. Whenever he wanted to convince us of something, they would brighten. Kane had a long and calm face, and unlike Musa, he was skinny and had short, really dark hair that he took great care of every morning or whenever we stopped at a river or a stream. He would rub water on his head and take his time to carefully arrange his hair. Are you meeting a girl somewhere? Al-Haji would ask, giggling. Kane, with his soft yet authoritative voice, always seemed to know what to say and how to handle certain situations and better than the rest of us. Whenever Al-Haji spoke, he used elaborate gestures. It was as if he wanted his already long hands to extend toward whoever he was talking to. He and Juma were friends. They walked next to each other. Juma was always nodding his head, agreeing to whatever the lanky Al-Haji said to him as we walked. Juma used his head to gesture rather than his hands. Whenever he spoke, he waved his head left to right. He kept his hands crossed behind his back most of the time, like an old man. Saidu and Moriba were almost as quiet as I was. They always sat next to each other, away from the group. Saido breathed hard as we walked. His ears were large, and when he was listening, they stood up like a deer's. Moriba always told him he must have extra hearing ability. Moriba mostly played with his hands, examining the lines of his palm and rubbing his fingers as he whispered to himself. I barely spoke. I knew Al-Haji, Kani, and Musa from my secondary school.